This is the water pump assembly out of my 2001 9.3. This basic style Saab pump is on a lot of Saab cars, and the vehicle coverage will be in the description so as not to take up time from the video. As far as diagnosis, there's a number of reasons you may need to replace the water pump. The two big ones are either it's leaking or the bearing is going in the pump and is making noise. If it's leaking, the most common place that you'll find coolant is out from the vent hole in the back of the shaft there. This will fill up and drip down on the block. So if you're getting coolant on the ground on the right front area of the car, it's possible that it's from here. You might also get it, not as common, but you might get it from the outer end where the pulley is. You've also got this pipe assembly where it goes into the block. Sometimes these O-rings can seep a little bit down the block, especially if it wasn't installed properly to begin with. We'll cover that later. And there's a coolant pipe in the back here with an O-ring, and it's important to get that seated properly on installation. And then you've also got a turbo coolant pipe down here with the banjo bolt, and it's very important that you use this proper fuel seal with the rubber on this end, copper on the outside, and this on the inside, and don't reuse the old one. This is extremely important to use this proper seal here. We'll talk a little bit more about this. Is very difficult to get in. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's the most awkward part of the job for me. Interestingly, much more common than you might think is for these to fail without leaking coolant. I've had a number of these, as we talked about more in the video, where the bearing starts to go here and this pulley will tap against or rub against the front cover, and you can cut a groove in the front timing chain cover, even to the point of where it cuts right through the cover, and the pump with the bearing really bad is still not leaking coolant, which is always kind of amazing to me that a bearing could fail that much and yet the seal doesn't give way to leak coolant there. But I've seen that quite a few times, and apparently that's what's happening on my Saab here. Is the bearing started to go. It was giving me almost like a faint rod knock sound on the car, but no coolant was leaking. So that's why I'm changing the pump today. Tools for the job. I recommend a nice assortment of extensions, a couple of 3/8 ratchets. I love to use the peanut ratchet, comes really handy. The spark plug style ratchet, 7mm, 8mm 1/4 inch sockets, 10mm 1/4 inch socket. T30 is the only Torex you're going to need on this job. And then 12mm socket, 13mm socket, and 10mm socket, 13 deep, 1/2 inch extensions, pliers, long needle nose come in real handy, a couple of screwdrivers, magnet can come in handy. As far as box wrenches, 10mm short, 12mm short, and a 10 and a 12 long. 13mm box wrench may come in handy too. And then a lot of times you're going to come across the hose clamps that really there's nothing like using the special tool rather than a pliers for those. And might need a little hammer, and my big pry bar is indispensable. And then I like to have WD-40 handy I like this Endura lubricant. It goes on liquid and then thickens up. It comes in handy for a lot of things. And I've got some petroleum jelly for if I need a little lubrication on some things. And really, that's about it as far as tools go for this water pump job. Also, I find something like a tray like this, for as you take the car apart, I've always found it very handy to kind of by sections in order of disassembly. I'll put like bolts here that all have to do with the same thing, like say power steering pump, etc., and then work my way down, and then some bigger things here. It makes it a lot easier when you go to put it back together again, because all your bolts and fasteners are in the right order. And then it's also easy to see if you're forgetting something, because you'll have an extra bolt that's unaccounted for or something. But I've just always thought this was a good practice over the years to stay organized, with especially on a bigger job, because you can forget. And instead of searching for a bolt and a screw, or so many times you take a car apart and things are in the wrong place. You know, the bolts, they just throw them in a pile, and then when they put the car back together, they will grab a bolt that they think, well, this is 10 millimeters, this will work, you know, but they're different lengths, different sizes, and they go in different places. So I like to put everything right back where I took it out. And it's a lot easier to stay organized from the beginning. It saves you a lot of time on the reassembly. So just a few tips there. Okay, I've got the camera on the passenger side floor, and I'm going to see if the microphone will pick up the noise that I suspect is the water pump pulley. Got some traffic going by and stuff, and they're working on the roof around the corner, but I'll see if it'll pick it up. Okay, the first step is we're going to take the belt off. First thing you got to do is take the air cleaner out to get to the belt. You got 7 millimeter for the clamps, and there's 3 10 millimeters holding the body of the air cleaner on, and then you'll have access to the belt. Tools we need: got a 1/2 inch extension, got a 7 millimeter socket, 10 millimeter socket, and then I've done hundreds of these, so I don't need this diagram, but this is just a nice tip. Anytime you're not absolutely certain of the belt routing, it's better not to think that you'll remember, because it can be surprising how you don't remember, and it can be rather difficult to figure the routing back out. And so what I always do, if I'm working on a car that I'm not familiar with, I just make a little diagram. This is the crank pulley and all your pulleys, and that way when the time comes to put the belt back on, you'll have no problems. I've also got, this is the hold the tensioner in a position. There's a little slot. You can line the 2 holes up and put this through there. If you don't have one of these, you can get the appropriate size drill bit, perhaps something of that nature, to put in the hole. airflow meter. You got to disconnect these couple clips here to get the harnesses. Just take a small pick or a little screwdriver and detach those. Body of your air cleaner. It's either just these on the bottom. I just loosen them just enough to slide it up out of there. There's the two on the bottom and the one on the top. See, your tool fits in this square hole in the top of the tensioner. Now it's extremely important that you have the tool all the way seated at the bottom. If there's any gunk or anything in there, clean that out, because it's very easy to break the square on there. Many times I've seen people break that, and then it's difficult to move the tensioner. And they're not cheap either, so make sure your tool is fully seated in there, because I believe that's probably in the majority of cases why those are broken, is the tool is not fully inserted. Now to get the tensioners, it's got to come this way, and so you've got this bracket from the one strut tower to the other. Comes out very easily. There's two 13mm nuts on each side and three 10mm bolts in the middle. So it's easier just to get this out of the way, and then you've got more room to work. So there's a view of the little tool holding the tensioner in position. This lines the slot up here. Now normally when I'm doing the water pump, unless I'm changing the belt too, I don't take it all the way off, because the hardest part is getting it around the crank pulley down there. Now, I'm used to doing it without taking the inner fender liner off, but many people will need to take the front wheel off and then the plastic fender liner to be able to get the belt wound around the pulleys down there, around the crank pulley especially. I've found ways to do it over the years. You just kind of get a feel for it. But since I want to run the car to hear if the noise stops, because here's your, let's see if we get a view here. Here, right here is the water pump pulley, and the problem you get if you can see there where my screwdriver's pointing, this front cover here, there's just, you know, hardly any clearance at all to begin with. You know, what is that? Like not even a 1/16 of an inch. But when this pulley, when the bearing gets a little play in it, the pulley will actually be hitting the front cover, and that's where you get that noise. Now what I've seen over the years is, it's hard to even see if it's hitting until you get it out of there. I can feel a little play with my screwdriver, and that can be just enough to make that noise. But we'll verify when I get the belt off. Now, the front cover, because it's kind of weird with these pumps, but when the bearing fails, they often don't leak any coolant. So people will keep driving it, and the pulley will actually can wear a hole through the front cover, which you know, it's not a huge deal, because really something like GAB weld or something, you could repair it, but it's a little awkward in here without taking the front cover off, which is a big deal. But anyways, you don't want that pump pulley wearing a slot in your front cover. But here's where it'll contact. Now, one thing I wanted to point out while I had the belt off, this top idler pulley, these can go just without warning, without even making any noise ahead of time. What happens is this pulley will seize up, and then the belt will smoke off of there. It'll melt the belt, it'll melt the plastic on the pulley. And I found that it wasn't unusual, you know, in the early days of these cars. You know, I'd come into the Saab dealer after the weekend. It wasn't unusual to have 2 or 3 cars sometimes that had this pulley melted and had thrown the belt, and the car had got towed in, because of course it drives all your accessories, your water pump, you'll overheat, and it drives your alternator and everything. So it would be a towed in car. Now the mileage was interesting. These were the new Saabs. As they came in, I found that the mileage where these failed was over 60,000, but not that much over 60,000 miles they would fail. You know, like pretty consistently. The original equipment pulley. So what I had started to do on the 60,000 mile services, which was a major service, and normally you would change the serpentine belt on that service, we would also change this pulley, because it was relatively inexpensive, and you're preventing a virtually certain breakdown at some point. That pulley's going to go. So all of this is being said that if you don't know when this was changed, then change it while you're in here with the belt off. Just go ahead and change this upper idler pulley. You won't be sorry. And if you know how long it's been since you changed it, regardless of how smooth this bearing feels, once it passes 60,000 miles, go ahead and replace it. It's just good insurance. I would never run one of these longer than 60,000 miles, because like I said, it's not like you might hear a noise ahead of time giving you a warning that the bearing is dry. They will just suddenly lock up and smoke the belt. I've seen it, you know, hundreds and hundreds of times, and it's pretty consistent. At least on the original equipment ones, it was between 60 and 70,000 miles usually when that would fail. So just a word of advice there. Yeah, the noise is gone. I've got the belt off, so pretty sure it's that water pump pulley hitting the front cover. So when I get the pump off of there, be able to take a look at the front cover and see if it's been scraped a little bit by the pulley. Now, one nice thing to get the water pump out, you can do everything from the top. You don't need to have the car on a lift. Everything's done from the top. You've got to basically get the power steering pump out of the way. I never take it all the way out, but I disconnect it from its mount, and then you take this mount out, and then you're able to. I usually just I don't even take the fill hose off. I'll depending on which end of the pump I'm working on, I'll just of the coolant pump. I'll just move the power steering pump out of the way. This side way or that way. It's just easier for me not to mess with the the fluid. So that's not a big deal. But basically, you've got this engine lift bracket's got to come off, 3 13mm brackets, this turbo valve, this turbo pipe, this hose that's connected down here for your turbo valve hoses. It disconnected down here. There's a plastic T. Be careful that you don't break that T. Now this turbo pipe here's got to come out, and so you're going to take this turbo pipe out, your heat shield, and that's all just to get access to the pump. Once you've got all this stuff cleared out of the way, there's more stuff that I'll show you there. But that's basically it. Work from the top, and you're going to get this stuff out of the way, and the pump will come right up out of here. Okay, let's get this water pump out of there. So the first thing that we're going to do is get the turbo inlet pipe out, and then we'll take the power steering pump out of the way, and then the power steering pump bracket. Now to get the turbo pipe out, we've got to take this pipe out, and we've got a 10mm down here, pull out of there, and we'll just pivot this up out of the way, take the vacuum hose off there and pivot it up. Take the heat shield off, just a 13mm down there, and it's okay if the stud comes out. Either way, the nut comes off the stud, or the stud will come out of the manifold, but no big deal, you can just thread it back down in there. And then we'll get this valve out of the way. It's connected to the other side of this turbo pipe. Once we get that moving, we'll get that out of the way. Now, I'll show you in a minute what you got to do to detach this pipe once we get everything out of the way. Now you're not going to be able to see much of what I'm doing here, but for me to get this done, I need to get it done. Get the pump out here while it's a nice day, and it's kind of awkward to figure out how to hold the camera and work on the car at the same time, and I don't have anybody to help me. So here we go. An O-ring down in there. These are usually fine to reuse. Just clean it. Okay, it'd be very hard to see, but down at the end of my extensions here, I've got a T30, and there's a clamp that goes around the base of this turbo inlet, and I just loosen that just enough to get it out. Here's the base of your turbo inlet. Give an idea of this clamp, your T30 here. And basically this clamp goes around. It's a little ridge here. So the same thing that's on this inlet is also on the turbo. As you tighten that up, it draws the two together, and then there's an O-ring in here. And I tend to just leave this O-ring alone and not change it if there's no problem with it, because it's sitting on there nice, it won't fall off, and it's just a lot easier to install. And I've never had a problem with these leaking, as long as it's, you take a look at it, as long as the O-ring looks okay. I just leave it alone. Okay, to get the power steering pump out, there's just two bolts. There's one down here. Got to go through a hole in the pulley. Got my socket on it, and then there's this long one through the top. So what I do is just crack this one loose first. Take the bottom short bolt all the way out, and then you can take the top bolt out, and then you'll have access to the bolts holding the bracket on. Okay, I misspoke on the top bolt for the power steering. Some models you have a long bolt that runs all the way through. This one has just got a short one in the back and a short one in the front that you also access through a hole in the pulley. So it's just three shorties. Just wanted to show you the back top bolt on the power steering pump bracket here. There's a little slider. Just gently tap it with the hammer. Just tap it back a little bit, so that when you go to put the pump back in later, it'll slide in easily. Otherwise, it'll be tight and you'll be fighting a little bit. But it's just a little slider sleeve. Just tap it back gently. You don't want to knock the ear off the bracket. It only takes a tiny tap to move it back, just a hair. Okay, here's your power steering bracket. Just these three bolts. I like to leave them in there. They're different lengths, and just makes it easier for reassembly. Now here's what I'm saying about leaving the pump connected. A little bit of a pain, but there's your coolant pump down here underneath it. But I'll move it back and forth as I need to get access to what I'm doing down here. Now, here's what's next. You've got your main lower hose, clamp there. It's hard to see it underneath here, but there's a little elbow hose there. Now I usually just disconnect it from this pipe. I'll move that clamp back and then take a big pry bar and just kind of slide the hose off of there, away from me there, before I dismount this tube. So while the tube still is connected to the back of the pump there, I'll get that hose off of there. And then that little 10mm, that you don't want to mix it up with any other ones, because the length is important, because the hole is only so deep in the body of the pump there. But that actually holds that lower pipe into the back of the water pump housing as well. And both of these pipes are, there's this 10mm on the right side of the head. It holds both of these pipes here, so you got to take that out. And the bottom of the pump housing here, this is probably the biggest pain with the whole job, is this banjo bolt here, because this pipe here is a coolant pipe
for the turbo, and you got to thread this banjo bolt out here. There's not much room. I usually believe that's a 12 millimeter head on there, and I use a little shorty. Once I break it free with a longer wrench, I'll use a little shorty to get it out of there. Now, before I disconnect these hoses here, a word on that as far as draining the coolant. You may wonder why I didn't drain the coolant out of the radiator, but a couple reasons. First of all, it's way down here, very hard to get at, especially without a lift. And sometimes if the radiator's been changed or somebody's messed with it, it could be easy to disturb the O-ring on it, and then you'll have a problem. And if you could take that out and drain the whole system, that'd be one thing. But that's the other reason I just leave it alone, is it doesn't drain. If you drain the radiator, it doesn't drain the coolant out of the pump, out of this hose, out of these pipes. And so what ends up happening is you have a mess anyways. And so it's just a lot easier. Just use a pan to collect the coolant underneath the car. And also you might need a couple pans, because it runs down the frame rail, runs toward the gravity, toward the back of the car in that direction, and the lower part of the subframe, it'll drip off of there too. So it's just kind of messy. And then don't plan on reusing any of that coolant, because by the time it runs down over all this dirty stuff and on the frame, it's all full of dirt. So, but that's the easiest way to do it, is just don't bother with draining the radiator. Just put a pan under it and catch as much of it as you can. I wanted to show you, I took the bolt out of the back. This pipe here, as I mentioned earlier, on this right side of the head there's a bolt here, but it gets this upper pipe out. But the other one, it still has a lot of tension on it. Around the back, it's attached by the thermostat right there, so you can loosen that one up. You don't really have to take it all the way off. It'll give you a little more movement on that pipe to get it out of the back of the housing on the coolant pump. Now here's where things get fun. I was talking earlier about this banjo bolt, so I cracked that free with the 12 millimeter box wrench, and you'll find you got to keep turning the wrench, and that a little peanut box wrench will work even better once you break it free. But you're also, this coolant pipe goes around to the let's see, the turbo here in the front. This one here, it snakes under and winds around to the coolant pump. So a lot of times I'll crack this one loose too on this end, just to give me a little more movement back at the other end, at the pump end, because getting this banjo bolts restarted, you don't want to cross thread it or anything, so you need some movement on that coolant pipe. You're finally at the stage for removing the pump. There's just 3 bolts that hold it on into the block. There's one on the top and 2 on the bottom. Now I just took one out of the bottom, and I couldn't find the other one. It's kind of, I'm thinking somebody forgot to put it in, and I took the one out of the top. You can see it's loose. Now the only thing holding it on is there's a tube that goes into the block back here under the manifold, and I'll just pop it off of there, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Then I'll just have to kind of wrestle with it a bit to get it up out of here, hold the pump, the power steering pump out of the way, and you got to play with it a little bit, and then pull it up out of there. Well, there you have it. These are the bottom 2 bolts. They sit right next to each other, but they just they you see where the one was in there, but they only put one in. I got to put two of them in here just for demonstration purposes. This outer one here was the one they left out, so I checked the threads. The threads are okay. So I thought, you know, maybe somebody had broken something off or something, but whoever did it just put one on the top, one on the bottom, left this other one out. Okay, one last thing for today, for the removal, and I'll be done for today. But this is the pump housing. That there's a little tube that goes into the block, and it's just an O-ring on this end of the tube that goes in the pump. There's an O-ring on the end of the tube that goes into the block. And so I'm going to take that tube out of the block now, because you want to change those O-rings. They come with the pump. Now, let's see. See it there under the manifold? And you'll see there's a little tab on either side of it. They go horizontal. You want to put it back in the same way. Now, to get this out of there, it'll be stuck in there on the O-ring. I take a big pry bar and I go down through a hole between two of the exhaust manifold runners on the one side, and then I'll come back on this side here on the coolant pump side, and I just gently pry each side, walk it out of there. Don't get over aggressive, be patient. Just you know, carefully pry it out of there. I use my big pry bar, but I work it gently. In fact, I'll put it on those tabs there, and I'll just twist it a little bit on each side. You don't want to get over aggressive, because then you'll damage something. So here it is. It sits in the block this way. See that opening? This longer tab will be on the left side of the car, and the little tab is on the right side of the car. On an American car, we're talking this long one is on the driver's side, and the short one is on the passenger side, and the opening facing toward the driver's side of the car. So I just took the pry bar and I'd get behind this little tab on either side, and I just pry it a little bit, and then come and on the other side pry that side a little bit. After you go try each side a couple times, you walk it out without damaging anything. Putting it back in is easy. Just you clean the hole in the block, and you clean this up, put new O-rings on it, and then lubricate the O-rings, and you can pop it in the block. And you make sure it's fully seated. These two tabs will hit up against the block and stop it from going in any further. Then you'll know it's fully seated. So that's it for today. Time to get some supper. Now here's where it was touching the front cover. It really wasn't contacting it too much. It you know, just slightly. I think more than anything, you know, because I've seen them, as I mentioned earlier, actually cut a groove right through here in the front cover. This is your front timing chain cover. I think more than anything, I feel some kind of funkiness in the bearing on the pump, and that was probably more responsible for the noise than anything, because it doesn't look like it was hitting very hard. For many years now, the new pumps, here's my new pump, they don't come with the rear water pump housing. One reason for that is, besides
that it's cheaper for them to make them this way is that there's a number of different rear housings. Some don't have the turbo, of course, and don't have this turbo coolant pipe. So anyways, you've got to save your rear housing and clean it up, and then you're going to put it back together. So that's what I'm going to do here. All these bolts on the back are T30s, Torx bolts. So it's very important to clean the gasket surface well on here, but without taking any of this metal off. This machine surface, you don't want to damage it. So I usually just take a razor blade to get the remnants of the gasket off, and then I'll polish this up a little bit with either a Roloc disc or a little sandpaper or something to clean this up real nice. And then the secret for me, oh, I might also mention, sometimes if these housings are old and they could be corroded and pitted, but they could still be reused. And what I always like to use, this anaerobic gasket maker, this Permatex stuff is just great. This is in fact what they use to seal on these engines, the front timing chain cover. They don't use a gasket, they just use this. And the same with the oil pan. So if you see on your car there's RTV on the oil pan or the front cover, somebody didn't know. This works much better than the RTV. So what I do with this, you can actually put it on both sides of the gasket, both of the surfaces, and then just put it together, and it's just a little extra insurance. I've never had anything leak. This, for years, called this the mechanic's friend, because I've never seen this leak on oil pans, timing chain covers, coolant pumps. This stuff is just fantastic. This is my friend. You don't want problems after you do a job, or even sometime later. This still holds up. It's great stuff. You also get assortment of O-rings. You can replace your O-rings on the tube. You got the O-ring for the back of the housing as well. There's a number of different sizes depending on your model. This tube, both of the O-rings are the same size. One is bigger than the other, and so you have to watch for that. There was a problem some years ago where the kits would come and they wouldn't have a large and a small, or two smalls. They only would have the two O-rings, and so you'd have to source another O-ring, which was a problem. But the kits now seem to pretty much, there's 3 in there, so it'll be 2 this size, and 1 larger one in case you've got the tube with the larger diameter. If you've got a vise, I like to hold the pump on this flat part that mounts to the engine. And the vise there just doesn't have to be that tight. You don't want to damage anything. But just on the flats here. And that gives you something to hold it securely while you put it together. Okay, nice and cleaned up. I'd like to just put just enough of this on there, and I'll smear it with my finger. And I'm going to put it on both surfaces. This stuff is also good because it can help hold a gasket in place, and depending on what you're working on, that can be handy. Of course, here's not a problem because this is easy here. A little bit smeared on there. Set my gasket. Lock the holes. And then same thing on the new pump. I'll smear some on here. We'll be good to go. See, it really doesn't take much. It's just lightly smeared on there. One other thing with this anaerobic sealer, this stuff it'll be in your toolbox for years. Probably all been familiar with. You may open a tube of RTV and it'll set up on you, and the tube will be no good after you use part of it. But this seems to just last indefinitely. Just tighten them down, kind of cross pattern evenly. And they don't have to be that tight. Just snug them up. I found over the years, I'm working on a lot of stuff, I just love a little peanut ratchet, like the snap-on ratchet. They're fairly expensive, but when you think about cost per use, I mean, it's like nothing. I think it was originally like $52, I don't know what they cost now. But it seems to provide just the right amount of pressure so that you don't over torque anything. I can just snug these bolts up with wrist pressure without that extra leverage. It's really just right for many things in car repair. You just get a feel for it. There's no need to use a torque wrench. Now, one other thing with this housing, I'm going to clean up. There's some corrosion here where the lower radiator hose attaches. I'm going to clean that up. And then, very important, the threads on the spandrel bolt and the threads in here, I'm going to run that in and out a few times with some lubricant on it, make sure these threads are nice. And then we'll talk about this in a minute, about how to get this in. Okay, just a couple important things I'm going to show you inside here. The weather's against me today. It's low 30s outside. It's supposed to snow, and I've got to work in the driveway. But I wanted to show you a couple things while I'm inside here that are very important, that I won't be able to show you outside. First of all, this pipe that goes into the block, I've got the new O-rings on there. I'll make sure the hole in the block is clean. Usually they stay pretty clean. Wipe it out and make sure, though. Then I'll put some lubrication on the O-rings, and then you can press it in there by hand, and it'll go up against the stops. And these horizontal tabs will stop it from going too far into the block, and then you can also tell that you've got it in all the way. So you'll be able to press that in by hand, and then not only I'll put a little lubrication on this O-ring, but I'll also put some on the pump there, just for ease of install. Now, as I mentioned before, perhaps the most difficult part of this job is getting this banjo bolt back in for the turbo coolant pipe. So what I've done is, first of all, I've cleaned up these threads and put a little lubricant on there, so that this will start as easy as possible in the car. Because you're up against a couple things that are extremely difficult. First of all, this is down, hard to get at. Your AC compressor's here, and there's an AC line that curves right here, and it's actually in the way, so like if the pipe is where it's supposed to be, you actually won't even be able to get the banjo bolt in there. So you got to have the pipe over a little bit. Slide the banjo bolt into the turbo coolant pipe, and then move her over in position. But now you've got a copper on this end that's already fixed, so that's no problem. But as I mentioned before, you want one of these fuel seals. Don't reuse the old one. Very important. But now you've got to drop that in there between the turbo pipe, and then push this in to the thread, and then start to turn it, which is quite a feat. So here's what I've come up with over the years to do that. Is we'll make believe this is just laying in that coolant pipe off to the side a little bit. I take a nice set of long needle nose pliers, and I'll grab the seal. This gives you enough leverage to squeeze it tightly enough, because you don't want to drop it, because if you drop it, it'll go down behind the AC compressor, and hopefully it'll make the ground, but it might not. It might be hard to retrieve it. So you're up against that pressure. Older people will remember the game Operation, where you had to do delicate work, and if you made a mistake, it would make that loud noise. But anyways, the younger guys won't know about that. So what I'll do is take my finger, and I'll drop this on down in there where it goes, and then I'll push the banjo bolt with my finger into the threads. Now, as I mentioned, you're very likely really going to want to have the other end of that turbo coolant pipe cracked loose on the turbo, because if that's tight, there's usually tension in that turbo pipe, and it'll tend not to line up like you want it so easily, and you really need everything to be as easy as possible doing this. So you drop that down there, then push your banjo bolt in. Then once you feel and you see that you've got it through your seal and onto that first thread. You got to hold it there with the tip of your finger. I know this is crazy, but this is the way I found to do it. I don't know what other guys do. Now you're going to need to turn this to start the thread. So I keep my pressure on there. This is the critical part. Now, you won't be able to even put, here's a little peanut 12 millimeter. You won't even be able to put that on there straight because of the way that AC line is. There's just not room. So I found you got to put it at an angle and try to catch the flats on there. And you don't have much movement, so if these flats aren't in quite the right position, you might not be able to catch a flat. But if you can grab it and start to turn it like so. And then you'll feel once you got the thread started. Now, if you're not able to turn it with this, which is quite possible, I have within arm's reach, because you don't want to, you got to keep your finger on here, otherwise you're going to lose your seal that you've already placed on there. So you want to have your tools within reach so you can keep your finger pressure on. What I've done over the years too is there's enough room at this end, because your coolant pipe is here. There's enough room on this end to grab this with the long needle nose again. Again, you're working from the top. I'm just putting my arm down so you can see. And then you'll just start to turn it with the needle nose tips. And you get enough turn on it to start your threads. And that's the whole thing. Once you get your threads started and you're sure of it, you can take your finger off. I know this is crazy, but this is the hardest part of the job. Now, at that point, to complete your tightening, you have to take your peanut from an angle. Then you can even take a longer 12 millimeter from the top, and you'll have to work it at, you won't be able to get it on straight. You'll work it at an angle. And once you've got it far enough in, at the end to get your final snugging, you finally will be able to get, like, say, the whole box portion on there, and then you can give it a nice snug. You want it snug enough for this copper seal to seal up. So you got to give it a, pretty good snugging there. And then don't forget, once you've got that in, it's all downhill from there. It's the rest of the job's not going to be so bad once you've got this in. I've always felt like this was the halfway point. Once I got this in, it's all just put it back together. But don't forget the other end of your coolant pipe that you would crack free the banjo bolt into the turbo. So make sure you snug that back up again. And that one's just got 2 copper seals. And I find that those aren't a problem sealing as long as you, give it a good snugging on the other end. And then you're good to go. Now, there's a couple other tricky things in putting it together. Getting the tube back in here. You gotta, I'll just point it out now because outside I'm probably not going to have a chance to really show you. But that coolant pipe that goes in here has a shoulder on it. And you'll know that your O-ring goes in there on the pipe. You'll know that you're in there all the way if the shoulder on the pipe goes down and it's flush with the surrounding surface. If it's sticking out, then your pipe probably isn't all the way in here and your O-ring's not seated properly. And you want that flush, because then the other pipe's got the hole down on it that your 10 millimeter. So this has got to be flush. So just take your time and make sure that that's really in there, not cocked. It's got to be in there properly to seal up. And then let me just explain a few other things now rather than outside, because when I get out there I'm going to have to work to get this in there. Now let's back up to when you first start to put this back in. As I mentioned, put a little lube in here. Place it on the block. on your tube here. Now your 3 bolts that go in, after you set it on there by hand, you want to start your 3 bolts that hold the pump to the engine block. And that might even be why, you'll recall when I took this out, there was only 2 bolts in it. Probably they couldn't start the 3rd one because they had already tightened up the other 2 too far. So while it's still just sitting loosely on here up against the block, to make sure everything's nice and straight, get all 3 of those 13mm bolts started by hand, and then run them all in by hand and get it, you're making sure that the whole time everything is nice and square and going on straight. Then you can snug up all 3 at the end. Don't tighten them up, like one of them up, or get, when you don't have the other one in, you want to just go nice and even. And that way you're making sure too that it's sitting nice on this O-ring where it should be, and it's not cocked or anything, and avoiding a leak there. So that's that. So then you'll have your pump on there, you got this back on. The last kind of tricky thing is putting that turbo inlet pipe on, and I'll try to show you that outside. There's a couple tips with that to make that a little easier. That's one of the awkward things if you've never done it before, that you know, over time you develop a feel for it and you can get them back on there. And then even then, every once in a while, one of them will give you a little bit of trouble. So, to get it on there where it's not cocked. So let's go outside now, and I'll see if it's snowing yet. See if I can get this pump back on the car today despite the weather not cooperating with me.
Oh great, just now, the second as I turned on the camera, it started to do a mix of rain and snow. But anyways, I wanted to show you, I'm just sliding the pump into position, as I'm getting it over that tube in the block. You're going to want to, 2 things. That turbo tube where I was talking about, that turbo coolant pipe, that one there. You're going to want to make sure that's not under the pump, otherwise you're not going to be able to get it on the pipe in the block. So you got to have that kind of in position. So you got to work with that. And then the tube that goes into the back of the pump, have your O-ring, your new O-ring already on the pipe, and a little lubrication on the O-ring and the pump housing where it slides in, because there's just not a lot of movement, so you're going to actually need to have that starting, not all the way in there yet, but starting into the pump at the same time that you're putting it on the block. So just some tips to avoid struggling with it as you're putting it in. Now, I might have misspoke when I was talking about earlier on the removal. There was a missing bolt, but I might have said there was 2 on the bottom, 1 on the top, but this was the missing one here, and so I happened to have one in my toolbox that was the right bolt. But anyways, just for clarification, there's 2 13mm on the top and 1 on the bottom underneath the shaft. And again, important, I started them by hand to make sure they're all started nicely, and that way the pump will be starting onto the O-ring on that pipe in the block nice and square. You won't have any issues there. And then by getting all 3 in, again, just for emphasis, start them all by hand. Then you've got them started in your threads, and because there's some movement in these holes, and so if you tighten one up, you're not going to get the other ones in, and it's also not going to go on straight. So just a little word of advice there. Now I'll snug these up. Now here's what I'm talking about on the tube that goes in the back of the pump. That, you see that shoulder on there? That's got to be flush. And again, putting a little lube on the O-ring will help it pop right in there. and then your other pipe, got your hole down. As I mentioned, that 10mm bolt there, it's very important that it's the same one you took out. It's the right length, because there's the distance, the thread, it'll bottom out, and it won't be fully tight if you got one of the ones that's too long. And once you pop that in there, I recommend you start your 10mm at the other end of the head. Get that started by hand in there before you finish putting that in and getting it fixed. Again, that's the approach I commonly like, is to get everything started by hand before I snug anything up. Okay, I'm happy to report that I was able to get that banjo bolt started. It really helped that I had lubricated the threads on there, cleaned it up, and ran it in and out of the pump housing while I was in the house. So I was able to get that started with my fingertips, and it wasn't as difficult as it can be sometimes. So I'm glad to have gotten that in there. Now, just one other thing on the topic of the banjo bolt and this fuel seal. I neglected to mention earlier, it would be a good idea to order up maybe a couple of these fuel seals. It's good to have one in case you drop one or something. And I've found that the shipping is expensive for just ordering one of these seals, and so you way overpay. So if you get your water pump, for example, at Euro Parts, and then order the seals at the same time, now you're combining your shipping. And if you spend, I forget what it is, I'm not sure the current amount, maybe $75, I'm not sure, but if you spend over a certain amount, then the shipping is free. And so then you're just paying for the price of the seal. But I noticed, like on eBay or other places to source them, the shipping is outrageous. Like, so the little seal can end up costing you $20 or something, which is ridiculous. It should just be, I don't know what they are, maybe $4 or something. But you don't want to shortcut and reuse the old one. You'll regret it. So get a few new fuel seals, and you'll be happy. Last thing on this banjo bolt, you can do your final snugging with a 12mm box wrench on there. I find it easier to use the peanut one with the open end at an angle to tighten it down. But once you want to snug it, you need the extra leverage. You can get the box end on there now, because so you've got enough clearance now with this AC pipe. It tends to get in the way when this is further out, but once you got it down, you can snug it up there. And then don't forget the other end of the coolant pipe on the turbo here. What I find is perfect for this, again that's 12mm as well, is I like to use a spark plug style ratchet, like the snap-on one here that you can put at the angle, and that's just perfect for snugging that one up. Okay, last tricky thing here. This is the turbo inlet tube, and getting this on here. Now I'll back off this, I loosened this clamp just enough to get it out of there, but now to put it on, it gives me like a, I don't know, it's just you get a sense of feel. It gives me like a base position for it. So I loosen it that far, then I've found that I've just got to loosen it a little bit more by hand. I'll back that off just a little bit more to be able to get it back on there. But the thing is, you don't want it too loose, because if it's, how should I put it, if it's just loose enough, then when you pop it on there, the clamp tends to catch it in position instead of having it fall back off again. But you just get a sense of feel for it. So I'm going to get it back on there, and then I'll show you one other thing, a check on it to make sure you got it on there square. Well, one thing I'll show you first, there's a, see that little hole there? That's like a window, and you can see the one half of the tube half, and that's on there properly. You'll see the turbo surface, and you'll see that they're mated up close together.
not cocked. And there's also one on the bottom too, like if you were under the car you could look up and check it, because these are awkward, they're easy to get them cocked. And but I'll show you another check. Besides the window, there's a way to check, a double check to make sure you've got it on there square so it won't leak.
Now here's the other, one of the other checks on the turbo inlet pipe is I snug the clamp up, but just enough that I can still move it, and then you can rotate it, and that way you can see that it's not cocked as you just rotate it back and forth a little bit. And don't do it when it's too tight because you don't want to damage the O-ring. But and then you can see through your little window down there. You see the two surfaces, the turbo surface and the inlet pipe surface. They're nice and square. Now you can have that look perfect on the top when it's cocked, but the bottom is out. You know, the bottom clamp is not around both surfaces, and then it'll be cocked. Now, the last check is up here. There's that, let me grab it. When you get to that point, there's this bracket that's like an engine lift, and it also gives a support to the inlet pipe, and it also holds your turbo valve here too. But anyways, you can see the position of the old bolt, the mark. And so when you have this back in position, that should be nice and flush. It'll be kind of obvious if the turbo pipe is inlet pipe is cocked out of position or something. This won't line up. I've had some, you know, where I thought I had it in there right, and then when I got to put this bracket on, this was not just like it should be, you know, a little bit off, and it made me realize, oh, the inlet pipe's not all the way on like it should be on the bottom. So that's like a final check. A tip on putting the power steering pump back in. Again, it goes back to put all 3 bolts in and tighten them down by hand, but don't snug them yet. And you never ever want to tighten up the one that's on the bottom first, as far as you never want to snug that one up. You want to snug that up last. Snug up the top 2 first, because what can happen is if the pump is out of position and you snug up the bottom one, you can actually crack the ear on your power steering pump, which you don't want to do. So tighten up the bottom one last. Now here's that final check I talked about on your turbo inlet pipe, to make sure that you're seated properly on the turbo down there before you finally tighten up that the clamp down there with your T30. And the check is with this bracket here, this engine lift bracket. It supports this on the top. You can see your old mark, and so that way, see how we still got rotation in it, but that should line up with your original marks. And if you've got this inlet pipe cocked on there a little bit, you're going to find it's not going to line up just right up here. It's going to be a little awkward, and that'll be a clue that you're off on the bottom of the inlet pipe there. And again, you can double check it if you have access to a lift, you're under the car. You can look through that little window hole in the clamp and see that you can see both surfaces, both mating surfaces are properly aligned, the top and the bottom. Okay, we got everything back together. I like to just go back and give everything a once over. You know, check, make sure you got everything done and not forgetting anything. And then these are pretty good about gravity filling. Like if you just fill it and let it settle a little bit, you'll hear the air bubbles, and the system will pretty much fill itself up without running the car. To start with that, once everything's settled down and the bottle has stopped going down, then you can start up the car and run it. Make sure the thermostat opens and everything's good and there's no leaks, and then top it off if it goes down some. What I'll do is I'll run the car, checking the temperature gauge, and also feeling the upper radiator hose, which will get warm when the thermostat opens and the coolant circulates. Well, I'm running the car to top off the antifreeze, make sure the thermostat opens, so I'll warm it up. As you notice on my information display, it's March 22nd, 39 degrees. And I don't recommend you do this when it's this cold, but I really had no choice. I had to work outside. But if you listen, that knocking noise is gone, which confirms that it was the water pump that was making that noise. It was kind of frightening when I first heard that noise. It almost sounded like a little bit like a rod knock, which wouldn't have been too good, but then I remembered how those water pumps can make that knocking sound, and that's, sure enough, that's what it was. So we'll be good to go.